Hello, my dear friend. Tonight we are together again on Histo Past Forward. Tonight's story traces a silence left in the shadow of time and carved into stones. Its name, the Watchers of Babylon. Were they the same beings as the fallen angels in the Bible and the Quran? This is a journey full of secrets hidden beneath the stars, the sound of iron, and words that should never be spoken. But don't be afraid, everything is very slow, very simple, and belongs only to the night. Now, I'm going to ask you for a small favor, Guy. Please dim the lights a little. Lie down and slowly close your eyes. This long and peaceful journey begins with the first chapter. And before we begin, if there's anything you'd like me to improve in this video, please share it with me in the comments. Also, if you write down your country and the current time, we can create a silent but beautiful connection among our viewers all around the world. Enjoy listening. The sky was always above, but in Babylon, its meaning was different. For other peoples, stars might show the way, herald the seasons, or even sometimes be a source of entertainment. But for the people of Babylon, the stars were a kind of ledger. There, a story was written silently, but continuously. It was written without any stylus, yet it was far older than stone tablets. It was inscribed upon the sky, and in this story, the leading role belonged to unseen but omnipresent beings. The streets of Babylon were not paved. The earth, hardened with dry mud, would crumble underfoot. These streets, scorching during the day, emanated coolness when night fell. In the most silent moments of the night, when everyone had retreated to their homes, some people still remained awake. These were typically scribes, priests, those who observed the sky and understood the signs that came from it. Ascending to the top of the ziggurat, one of Babylon's highest structures, these individuals searched for something in the silence of the stars. Perhaps not the gods, but the traces of other beings who had placed a distance between themselves and the gods, because in Babylonian belief the gods were in the heavens, humans on earth. And those in between, their place was uncertain. They were sometimes called Anunnaki, sometimes Igigi, and in some texts, their names were never mentioned. They were referred to only by epithets. The Watchers, the Observers, those who carry forbidden knowledge. In Babylon's official archives, that is, in texts commissioned by the king, the names of these beings were not explicitly stated. But in older texts kept by the priests, there were certain passages that were whispered and read only during ceremonial times. These passages spoke of beings who descended from the sky, contacted humans and taught them writing, metallurgy, medicine, and celestial calculations. This knowledge was useful, yes, but it was also cursed, because this knowledge had been given without the gods' permission, and if knowledge was unauthorized, it was no longer a blessing, but a punishment. Imagine a young scribe assigned to a corner of the ziggurat. His duty was to transcribe what the priests said, to assist them. During the day he struggled with the heat, and at night he worked, shivering under the stars. One night an old priest asked him to read what was written on an ancient tablet. The tablet read, "When the eyes descended to the earth, they caused a flood. The eyes whispered unknown things into the heart of man, and then they plunged into silence." The scribe shivered as he read these words. Because the priest merely looked, offering no commentary, no approval, no explanation, only silence. The next morning, the scribe sifted through the old archives. Before the sun rose, he pulled out broken tablets from one of the stone chests in the temple courtyard. Some had incomplete writings, some had chipped corners, but there was one commonality. All of them mentioned some kind of watching activity. One read, "7 beings descended from the sky to the earth. They were called eyes. They watch, but do not speak." Another, "When the sky opened, humans met them eye to eye. From those days on, whispers began on earth." These tablets were not official, but ceremonial writings, meaning they were read only on specific days by specific people and then stored away again. It was not considered appropriate for everyone to access them, but the scribe was trying to fill the void created by the priest's silence. Perhaps he wanted to unravel the truth hidden by silence with words. As he read these, he realized that the fundamental characteristic of these beings called watchers was not merely to impart knowledge. The real issue was that they should not have imparted that knowledge. In other words, these beings were in a place where they should have concealed the knowledge, but they could not resist opening it to humans. This was not explicitly written in Babylonian mythology, but the language of the tablets occasionally leaked it. Knowledge was high above. When it descended, the balance was disturbed. An account from the Sumerian period stated that a being who descended from the sky taught humans the secrets of agriculture. Until then, humans were only gatherers. But with this knowledge, they learned to cultivate the land, to time, to calculate the seasons. And after every piece of knowledge, a surveillance began. Humans were no longer alone. A human who knows they are watched is no longer the old human. The earth began to change. Though this narrative seems like an ordinary, airy story, it carries a heavy question. If this knowledge brought good to humans, why were those who gave it punished? Who punished them? And why was it not explicitly written who imposed this punishment? While the scribe was preoccupied with these questions, another priest was working in the star observation room on the topmost floor of the ziggurat. This priest was old, his eyesight was not good, but with years of experience he knew by heart which star would rise, where in which season. One day he told the young scribe, "Sometimes stars appear before their time. That is when we know something is wrong." Stars appearing before their time were an important sign for Babylonian priests. Such shifts were called broken sky, as if the order of the heavens had been interrupted for a moment. In the years when these disruptions occurred, strange events were recorded on tablets, sudden deaths of kings, droughts, unrest among the people. And in all these events, the stars were not shown as warnings, but as a kind of cause. This priest, by looking at the stars, was trying to understand not only the weather, but also human behavior. Once he saw a star's trajectory deviate from what was expected. At the same time, a young man in the city had been arrested for drawing secret symbols on a temple wall. The priest connected these two events. "The watchers are still here," he said, "and they are still making some speak." This phrase stuck in the scribe's mind. Who was making them speak? And more importantly, whose voice were people hearing? In sacred texts, the source of knowledge is the gods. But some expressions in Babylonian tablets imply that this knowledge also came from another, in-between source. Neither fully divine nor fully human, neither belonging to the earth nor entirely to the heavens. These beings were caught between two worlds. The closest example to this were figures known as Apkallu. Apkallu were often depicted in fish-shaped garments. This indicated their connection to both water, that is, subconscious knowledge, and the gods. According to legend, 7 Apkallu brought knowledge to earth. Writing, mathematics, temple architecture, laws, all began with the teachings of these beings. But then, these beings were never seen again. Some wrote on tablets that they were recalled before the flood, others that they were punished, As the scribe examined these stories, he began to see a cycle. Knowledge is given. Humans change. But then the givers of knowledge disappear, and humans progress using that knowledge, but also begin to live with a kind of fear, as if an eye is constantly watching them. Every developed technique, every calculation made, seemed to attract the attention of a new eye. One night, the sky grew unusually dark. Neither stars nor moon were visible. Although the weather was clear, the sky had taken on a murky blackness. The temple fell silent. The priests did not go out. This was unusual. That night, the scribe wrote only one sentence on a tablet. When the watchers arrive, the stars hide. This sentence would be found years later in a stone chest. No one would be able to fully explain what these words indicated, but the date of the clay on which it was written would coincide with an unexpected eclipse in the sky, and after that year, some star names would be removed from texts in Babylon. Even mentioning their names would now be considered dangerous. Knowledge was now silent, but even silence can sometimes be as powerful as a scream, especially in Babylon, especially if it is written in the sky. And so another question arises in your mind. Is knowledge covered by silence truly forgotten? Or has it merely been hidden from those who ask the wrong questions? Time passed, the stars remained the same, but the hands that read them changed. In Babylon, tablets cracked, walls crumbled, but the sky did not fall silent because it was still writing in a language that people could no longer read, but with an order that made its presence felt. Centuries later, in another city, in another language but with a similar fear, texts emerged. This time the texts were not on papyrus but on parchment. The pens were different, but the content was familiar. The watchers described in the Book of Enoch, like the stars of Babylon, were in their place. They had descended from heaven to earth, teaching forbidden knowledge to humans, metallurgy, adornment, magic, warfare. And then, by God's command, they were chained. Their punishment was not to be cut off from the sky, but to watch forever without being able to interfere. This narrative strangely overlapped with the description of non-speaking eyes in the Babylonian tablets. Again, knowledge, again transgression, again punishment. Again, a story of something watching, but whose voice is no longer heard. In the Quran, tracing this path leads to the names Harut and Marut. It speaks of two angels assigned to Babylon. They were taught magic, but they warned humans, "We are only a test, so do not misuse this knowledge." In this narrative, the test that comes with knowledge is like an echo of that silent warning in Babylon's tablets. And again, there is a fall. Again, knowledge, when brought to earth, transforms into something else. The prohibitions written in Babylon's sky are not merely things etched with a stylus. They are also etched into memory, fear, and intuition. Every civilization has named its own stars, but the common thread is the feeling that an order in the heavens has been disturbed, and the traces of this disturbance are still carried. You might think that ziggurats no longer stand, but their form continued in other structures, other monuments. Every towering edifice is an earth-sky connection. From Babylon to Egypt, from Jerusalem to Athens, every civilization wanted to touch the sky. But ascending to the sky was not always just a technical achievement, it was also a boundary transgression. And what happened to those who crossed the boundary was always conveyed in incomplete sentences, in silent lines. There was a rumor in Babylon, "It is easy to carry knowledge, but if you forget where you got it, that knowledge will carry you." This expression, though it seemed to lose its meaning over time, was reborn in different words in every new age. As science progressed, More people wanted to reach the stars, but the old fears did not disappear. There were always those who wondered if every rocket going into the sky was being watched by another eye, because the idea of being watched is one of humanity's oldest intuitions. Now, stars are observed with modern telescopes. They are given code names, classified by numbers. But if an eye still looks as it did in Babylon, that silent yet noticeable eye, perhaps it is still watching, and perhaps knowledge is still a test. Today the name of Babylon appears on maps as an archaeological site, but the sky it wrote upon is still above us. The stars are in the same place, and every night someone looks at them again. Perhaps you, perhaps someone else. Perhaps a being, thought to be forgotten, still maintains its gaze. Because some prohibitions are never erased, they just become invisible, and every time you look at the sky you witness their silence. And perhaps the real question begins now. Are we still being watched, or do we just feel as if we are? Rising in the heart of Babylon, the E-Sagila Temple was one of the first structures to greet the sunlight. In the ear lie hours of the morning, even before the wind awoke. This grand stone edifice stood like a silent question posed to the sky. Who protects this place? There was no visible answer to the question. There were no guards at the temple gate, no iron bars, often not even people. Yet no one dared to touch those walls, for the walls themselves were a kind of eye. The figures seen with every glance were felt even when not looked at. In the inner courtyard of E-Sagila there were reliefs carved into the stones. Beings with broad wings, human faces, often wearing garments resembling fish scales. Sometimes a figure holding a writing tablet, sometimes a watcher, standing behind a kneeling human. Were these merely religious decorations, or were they truly a form of record, silent witnesses? If one day you stood in the shadow of this temple and observed its walls for a long time, the first thing that would catch your attention would be the expressions on the faces of the figures. Neither entirely serene nor overtly menacing, clear but not empty. They watch, not just you, but as if they are watching time itself, as if searching for something within time. Every line, if not a judgment, is like a measure. What they measure is unclear, but nothing escapes their eyes. These figures on the walls are the architectural memory of Mesopotamia. In Akkadian, they were sometimes called Apkallu, meaning wise beings. According to some, they were messengers of the gods. According to others, they were beings tasked with imparting knowledge to humanity before the Great Flood. But one detail was common in every narrative. These beings both gave knowledge and observed. They were not just teachers, but also guardians. As the evening coolness descended, the temple's stone floor would begin to cool. Then the scribes and priests would withdraw from the courtyard, leaving only the attendant who guarded the sacred texts in the inner sanctum. That person did not actually work alone, because directly behind him, flush with the wall, stood an Apkallu relief. The attendants did not consider this a coincidence. When writing or reading sacred texts, you needed an eye behind you. This eye would bear witness to every word you wrote. Over time, this practice became a tradition. At least one Apkallu figure was placed in every important writing room or archive. They were made of stone, but they were seen as living beings. Because in Babylon, knowledge was not merely read. Knowledge was also watched, protected, and sometimes hidden. In some legends dating back to the Sumerians, there are expressions implying that these Apkallu figures were not merely stone carvings. According to one legend, the first Apkallu, Uana, descended from the sky in fish form and taught humans writing. He taught writing and returned, but his shadow remained in the stones. Even after he left, his eyes remained here, reads one line. This sentence appears in the private tablets of scribes and is rarely used in ceremonial readings, because the idea of an eye remaining in stone was not just a mythological question, but also a theological one. If someone from the sky leaves an eye here, is it surveillance or a warning? The temple priests, when explaining the presence of these figures, always described them as protectors, but they never said whom they protected them from. External dangers, internal dangers, or humanity's own excesses. Because in Babylon, faith looked inward more than outward. Something was not bad because it was outside, but bad because it came outside. And watching was not just watching the enemy, but also scrutinizing one's own soul. Some priests, after praying, would bow towards these figures and whisper things to them. These whispers were not documented, the scribes would not write them down. But it is known that this practice continued for generations, and this is another indication that the figures were perceived as living beings. The walls were not just stone, but memory, and the eyes of memory never closed. For this reason, Babylon's temples were not just places of worship, but also places of surveillance. Every prayer was offered in the presence of an eye. Every record was written under a gaze. The eyes on the temple walls over time became part of the collective memory. When a child lied, their mother would say, "The Apkallu saw you." When a merchant cheated in measurement, someone would call out to them, "The wall does not forget you." Over time, the meaning of these eyes began to change. Some began to see them as symbols not of the gods, but of beings hidden from the god's wrath. Because some figures on the walls were different, the same garment, the same pose, but there was a brokenness in their eyes. Some of their faces were half erased. The eyes of some were carved out. This was not vandalism. These figures were made this way, deliberately incomplete, deliberately broken. This raised another question. Were these beings guarding the temple's statues of those who had once been punished? One text contains the following expression. Those who fell from the sky were inscribed on the earth as figures. They no longer had voices, but their forms were not forgotten. This line was a subject of debate among priests for a long time. Some argued it was a mere metaphor. Others claimed it was the Babylonian equivalent of the Watchers, the fallen beings. If true, the eyes on the temple walls were not just protectors, but also the silent screams of beings kept under surveillance. It is not easy to decide whether the eye is watching or being watched. The temples built this duality with stones. Perhaps those figures were watching you, or perhaps you were witnessing their gaze severed from the eternal sky. And so the oldest question in Babylon's temples resurfaces. Who truly protects these walls? Do the figures watch the people, or do the people search for traces of a forgotten crime in those figures? When the morning sun rose, the stone walls of Sagila revealed another face. The fine carvings that remained in shadow at night became distinct with the arrival of light, and the figures in the reliefs appeared more vivid. This change in light did not merely create a visual difference. In Babylon, priests determined the timing of ceremonies according to the reflection of light on the figures. The eyes of some figures would shine precisely at a certain hour, then retreat into shadow again. This moment was called awakening, and there were those who believed that this awakening belonged not to the gods, but to the beings in those stone figures. This idea was not explicitly written down, but it was passed on through whispers among the people. They still wake up, but only at certain times, old women would say, and small children, while playing, would try not to step on the shadows of the figures. This was not an act of respect, but of protection. Because shadows, in Babylon, were never just darkness. The fact that some figures on the temple's outer walls had been erased over time was a detail initially interpreted by archaeologists as natural wear and tear. However, upon closer inspection, it was observed that these erasures were not random, but concentrated specifically on the eye areas. The eyes of some figures were carved out, while for others only one eye was erased. Researchers who believed this situation was a deliberate practice argued that the figures on these walls had transformed into a different perception over time. Could some figures over time have come to be seen as carriers of dangerous knowledge? Perhaps these symbols, initially accepted as instructors, had turned into a fear in the minds of the people, especially for those who believed that the knowledge came from somewhere else, not from the gods. And this fear might have led to the deliberate erasure of the eyes of some figures, because if the eye watches to render it sightless would be the only method of protection, such a movement might have found its reflections not only at the popular level, but also in the administrative echelons of Babylonian society. One tablet records that some figures needed to be removed during the renovation of temple walls. The reason is not stated, but the phrase inappropriate impression in the same tablet suggests that the figures, at some point, created undesirable associations. Perhaps these figures told more than the people thought. Yet not all figures received the same treatment, especially the figures located in the inner sections, visible only to priests, were carefully preserved. These were more detailed, more clearly carved, and usually the figures held an object in their hands, a writing tablet, a seal, sometimes a staff. The shadows of these figures who carried knowledge in their hands did not fall during the day. Because these rooms were dark, they were lit only by torches. For this reason, the faces of the figures were never fully seen. They were always in semi-darkness. In this semi-dark environment, even the texts written by the priests would be different. Instead of the expressions used in ordinary tablets, terms like voiceless words and lines not read by the eye appeared here. Some tablets were written not merely to be read, but for something to be remembered. But what and for whom to remember? Some researchers suggest that these writings were addressed to the watcher beings. That is, people were speaking these writings not to each other, but to the figures. This is a different relationship than classic prayer or supplication. It is like a silent exchange. Information is given, but no sound is made, because in Babylon, some information was conveyed only through gaze. Over time, the belief that formed around these figures created a new narrative. This narrative was the idea that the figures did not protect the temple. Rather, the temple was built to keep these figures inside. That is, the walls were built not to prevent external dangers, but to prevent what was inside from leaking out. This idea is not explicitly written in any text, but the reluctance of some priests to stay in the temple at night and the fear of going outside the wall, expressed in some texts, support this possibility. The following lines on a tablet are quite striking. They speak to the wall, but their voices remain behind the wall. If an echo comes, they have leaked outside. This line is an expression not merely of a physical sound, but of the echo of a being. This echo might be a kind of knowledge, an intuition, or a behavior. Perhaps these figures were once alive, perhaps they still are. One day a young apprentice asked an old priest, "Do the eyes of these figures truly see?" The priest did not answer the question directly. He merely pointed with his finger to a spot on the figure. The place he showed was far from the figure's eye, a small notch in the fold of its stone garment. And he said, "It is not only the eye that sees. One who knows how to look sees from everywhere." This answer did not satisfy the child, but it silenced him, because in Babylon the answer to some questions is silence. The walls do not whisper what they want to tell, but they always watch, and sometimes a glance reminds one of more than 1,000 words. That is why the question of who protected Babylon's temples is still alive, because the eye sees but does not speak. The wall is silent but warns, and we still haven't decided, are we the observers or the observed? Time flows like stone in Babylon, slow, heavy, and leaving traces. The eyes on the temple walls have continued to watch for centuries. But the meaning of this gaze is changing. Now there are those who see them merely as religious symbols. Others, however, consider them like the spirit of the past, warnings transformed into monuments. But there is still something on the walls, not lost, just buried in silence. Even today, when archaeologists uncover these eye figures in their excavations in the inner sections of Babylonian temples, they first pause for a few seconds to look. This is not a gesture of respect, but rather an intuitive hesitation. Because the positions where these figures were placed are not random. Some are above entrance gates, some are at the top of staircases, and some are in blind spots visible only when viewed from inside. There is a room where the eyes of a figure become distinct only in the morning light. The shadow of another falls to the ground only on a single day of the year, within a specific time slot. Was this just an architectural coincidence, or had the eyes on the walls established a relationship with time itself? Some descriptions in ancient Babylonian texts imply that this architectural arrangement was deliberate. The watchers shine at sunrise, they do not fade at sunset, because the light looks at them, not they at the light. This expression indicates that the wall figures were not dependent on light. On the contrary, they were seen as centers that directed light, seem like an ordinary wisdom saying it formed the basis of the relationship established with the figures. That is, the figures did not watch you, they watched what you thought. This was not external control, but internal introspection. One had to learn to watch oneself. Perhaps this was the true purpose of the eyes in the temples. Over time, the meaning of the figures began to divide. One group of priests still saw them as messengers of the gods, while another group began to believe that these figures belonged to something older. This division caused a silent but permanent rift in Babylon's belief system. This rift was not visible in official texts, but differences emerged in private prayers and ceremonial practices. Some priests never turned to the figures, while others would not pray without kneeling before them. According to one legend, in a room of the temple, there was an unnamed figure. This figure was not described in any tablet, nor used in any ceremony, but it was there, and though its presence was known, no one approached it. Only one day, a young priest dared to bow before this figure. From that day on, he said nothing. He only remained silent. After his death, those who entered his room found a tablet beside his bed which read, "Some eyes do not look at you, but at what you suppress within. If you watch long enough, you too can see it." This expression reveals the symbolic depth of the eye figures in Babylonian thought. They were not an external threat, but the echo of the silence within. The deeper one descended, the closer those eyes felt. Perhaps this is why many priests at some point in their lives began to speak with the figures on the walls. These conversations were not madness, but consciousness. A conversation not with the eyes, but with the heart. Centuries later, a researcher excavating in the ruins of Babylon found a buried tablet in the inner part of the temple. The writings on the tablet were quite corrupted, but one sentence was still legible. "The eyes always watch, but with which eye do you see?" This question has stood for centuries, unrepeated. But the echo of the question has not been lost. Today in the modern world, the word surveillance carries other meanings: cameras, sensors, algorithms. But the eyes on the walls of Babylon still remind us of something different. That surveillance begins from within, not from without. That the true guardian is not a wall or a figure, but the individual's own conscience. And perhaps that is why the eyes on Babylon's walls still do not speak, because it is now expected that we understand what they have to say. They only watch. What we understand is up to us. So when you look at a wall, do you see only stone? Or do you see there the reflection of a pair of eyes that have already looked at you? The plain of Shinar, stretching as far as the eye could see, transformed into a scorched yellow sea by day and a mirror of the sky by night. This plain was the heart of Mesopotamia. Its soil was fertile, but this fertility came at a price. Humans had to work, and order had to be maintained. The gods had willed it so. But humans did not always remain silent. Sometimes they asked questions, and the plain of Shinar was the place where that first great question was asked. Why are we down here? Narratives concerning the origin of Babylon always speak of a structure. But this structure is not merely made of stone and brick. This structure is an idea, a claim. To reach God, or more accurately, to arrive at where the gods reside. This desire, at first glance, is innocent, but the priests of Babylon always approached it with caution, because this desire in every age takes on a different language. To reach, to possess, to be equal. As you walk through this plain, you might have seen a distant mound rising. Today it might be flattened, buried under sand. But once a great tower rose there. What we know today as the Tower of Babel was actually called Etemenanke, the foundation of heaven and earth. This structure was not just an architectural masterpiece, but also a test of human will. This great structure on the plain of Shinar is always referred to in official records as an altar dedicated to God. But ancient tablets also contain different expressions. One tablet states, "Brick was laid upon brick, but without command." This statement had caused debate among the priests. From whom was the command? The gods or someone else? In that era, cities were built according to the gods. Every city had a god, every god a temple. But this structure on the plain of Shinar was not directed towards a specific god, but directly towards the heavens. That is, this structure resembled not a gift to God, but a means of transportation. This idea created a silent but deep unease in Babylonian society. The priests did not participate in the construction of this structure. Instead, ordinary people, farmers, stonemasons were employed. This in itself was extraordinary. Normally, when a temple or sacred structure was built, priests would manage the process, ensuring that the god's will was followed. But here, they merely observed. No one gave orders, yet everyone continued their work, as if a collective consciousness commanded the construction of this structure. This situation was later described as a rebellion in sacred texts. Both in the Old Testament and in some Syriac texts, narratives about this tower begin similarly. Humans decide to build a structure to reach heaven. Their aim is to be like the gods, or to rule the heavens, and this act is a rebellion against the divine order. In the Babylonian tablets, this event is not directly referred to as a rebellious act, but some expressions describe the unusual nature of the structure. For example, it is written that when one ascended to the top of the structure, a silence was heard. This silence was the absence of the humming wind that normally made the god's presence felt. The priests called this celestial rejection. That is, the heavens had not recognized this structure. Another tablet recounts the dream of an official attempting to climb the tower. In his dream, the sky opens, but from it descends not a light, but an eye. This eye says nothing to the official, it only watches. And this gaze makes the official fall to his knees. When he awakens, he is unable to speak. It is rumored that everyone who climbed the tower after that day was plunged into silence. This narrative shows that a different architectural understanding developed in Babylon, distinct from temples. Normally, gods descended to earth, but here humans were trying to ascend. This reverse direction was a sign of danger in Babylonian thought. Everything had its place. What was in heaven should remain in heaven. What was on earth should be content with earth. This structure was the rebellion of the earth against the heavens. A priest wrote about this tower. The structure rose, but man shrank, for rising is not the same as growing. This sentence summarizes the idea of balance in Babylon's belief system. That is, what is important is not to be high, but to be in one's place. Balance is achieved by knowing one's duty, but the tower disturbed this balance. In the early days of construction, a new brick was added to the tower every day. People carried mud in their hands, stones on their backs. There were no orders, yet no one stopped, as if an instinct told them this structure had to be completed. But why? The tower, not as a means to reach the gods, but as an attempt to make contact with the watchful beings. If this is true, Babylon's first great structure was not only an engineering marvel, but also an attempt to reverse divine surveillance. As the tower rose over time, human behavior began to change. Individuals who were once humble now spoke loudly, gave orders, and looked at the sky as if defying it. This psychological transformation is described in Babylonian tablets as a corruption of language. Although people continued to speak the same language, the meaning diverged. The same word was used to describe different things. Not unity, but confusion arose. This situation is referred to as the confusion of tongues in sacred texts. But according to Babylon, this was not a punishment, but a natural consequence, because people were no longer speaking with the same intention. Everyone's purpose had become different. The tower was no longer being built for the gods, but for one's own glory. A priest wrote after the tower was destroyed, "The structure was razed to the ground, but what was high remained in hearts, and that height now becomes an eye everywhere." This line explains that the idea of the tower, though physically destroyed, continued mentally. If man cannot reach heaven, he carries heaven within himself, and then the difference between the observer and the observed disappears. Perhaps the first rebellion in the plain of Shinar began not with stone, but with a gaze. One day, while looking at the sky, man first asked, "Why not me?" And the echo of that question has reached us to this day. Every tall building, every space journey is an echo of that first question. What began in Babylon still continues, but perhaps the real question is, if it is possible to reach the sky, what will we truly encounter there? A reward, or the silent gaze of those ancient eyes that have always watched us? As the tower slowly rose, the morning mist of the plain of Shinar began to dissipate later. Previously, when the sun rose, the plain would immediately warm up and the shimmering vapor would dance on the surface of the earth. But as the tower grew, this mist began to linger longer on some mornings. The priests viewed this not as a natural phenomenon, but as a change in balance. For this plain no longer belonged solely to the earth. Humans had placed the foundation of something belonging to the sky upon the earth. One of the striking things during the construction process was that no stone was placed with a sacred ritual. Normally, when the first stone of a temple was laid, priests would recite divine chants, offer a small sacrifice, and seek the god's permission. But no one did such a thing for this tower. No one even suggested it. It was as if the nature of the structure itself did not require permission. This situation caused deep discomfort among the priests. Many priests did not directly oppose the tower's construction, but they did not support it from the temple either. Their silence for Babylon was always a sign that needed to be read carefully. The laborers working in this silence, however, were in another world. Women carrying mud, men arranging bricks, children carrying loads. Everyone was doing their job, but over time something changed among the workers. What at first seemed like just a task gradually turned into a kind of pride. "We are building what is high," they began to say. These sentences, initially whispered, eventually began to be spoken in public squares. And one day, a stonemason working on the tower's construction said, "We no longer have to look down. We are high now, too." When this statement reached the priests, there was silence for a few days. Then some priests remained in the inner section of the temple for a long time and did not come out. This behavior indicated that they were searching for a new sign, because in Babylon the most dangerous thing was not an open rebellion, but a silent arrogance that slowly grew. And the tower was now rising not just with stone, but with this arrogance. As the steps leading up the tower multiplied, some people began to race to ascend it. Everyone wanted to reach the highest point, to see further. A scribe recorded this situation thus: "The tower is no longer being built for the gods, but for the eye." This line, beyond an architectural fact, indicated a spiritual shift. The tower had become more of a spectacle than a connection. To the west of the plain of Shinar, on the slope of a hill, lived an old man. He knew the ancient traditions, spoke little, but what he said always carried weight. He had never been to the tower. But one day a child came and asked him, "Don't you want to see the tower too?" The old man merely shook his head. "I always looked at the sky, but I never invited their eyes." This sentence was not later included in tablets, but it spread through oral tradition, because this expression showed the difference between looking at the sky and calling it down here. In Babylon, looking at the sky was respect, but the tower was not just looking, it was trying to bring the sky down here. This was crossing the boundary. As people climbed the tower, they began to develop new behaviors. Those below were now looked down upon. Among families, the phrase, "Our son works in the tower," became a source of pride. Working in the tower had turned into a social status, yet, once, only priests could approach the gods. Now everyone seemed to have this opportunity. But this feeling of equality also brought with it a division. One day, an argument broke out among the workers on Tai Tower. The reason was who worked on a higher floor, because now height meant not just distance but superiority. This argument quickly turned into a fight, and that day, for the first time, a worker fell from the tower, not only physically but symbolically, because that fall showed that the idea of the tower no longer united people but divided them. The priests saw this event as a sign. In a special ceremony held in the temple, the high priest used this phrase: "It is good to seek height, but if you drown in it, who will save you?" This sentence was later repeated among the people of Babylon as a warning. But the tower was still rising. Everyone was focused on their own floor, their own brick, and each one saw only their own height. Meanwhile, the sky was silent. There was neither storm nor rain. But on some nights, those who climbed the tower said they saw strange things. One worker recounted seeing a pair of eyes in the sky while sitting on the highest step of the tower. The eyes did not look at him. They passed through him. He said he felt watched not by their eyes, but by his heart. The next day, that worker stopped working. He never returned to the tower. He no longer wanted to climb up. This story quickly spread among the people. Some interpreted this event as madness, others as a divine warning, but its main effect was felt in the silence. People stopped talking. Those who climbed the tower no longer joked, but merely averted their gaze. It was as if something in the sky had awakened, as if this ascent had also activated another gaze. A priest wrote in one of his secret tablets, "The sky had been silent for a long time, but silence does not always mean acceptance. Sometimes it is patience, sometimes it is observation, and sometimes it is punishment." As the construction of the tower continued, linguistic shifts began among the people. The same word began to be used with different meanings. The word high was no longer used only in a physical sense, but also in a moral one. But for each person, its meaning was different. This situation led to small disagreements escalating. Two people who once understood each other very well now interpreted each other differently, even in the same sentence. Babylon's silence no longer carried a sense of peace, but of alienation. Everyone knew of the tower, but no one remembered why it was being built. Perhaps it had begun with a belief, but now it had become merely a competition. And the tower was no longer a structure, but a mirror. Everyone wanted to see themselves there, but the closer you get to the mirror, the more distorted your reflection becomes. Perhaps that first rebellion was hidden in a single sentence. Why are we down here? But now everyone was asking a different question. Why am I not at the highest point? As the tower rose day by day, the plain of Shinar continued to change in silence. The texture of the earth had hardened, the birds had changed their routes, and the wind had lost its direction. This invisible change did not escape the eyes of Babylon's ancient priests, because they always paid more attention to what the earth didn't give than to what it did. And this time, the earth was no longer speaking. It was as if it hadn't accepted what was happening, but had also given up resisting. Among the priests, linguistic breakdown was no longer an abstract concept. In a very real sense, people had begun to misunderstand each other. What initially seemed like minor confusions gradually extended to temple texts and even market debates. The same word conveyed different meanings to different people. High, clean, low, dark, all of them now meant something different to everyone. A priest expressed this as follows: "The tower rose, words, sea, rumbled." This sentence was like a summary of the most dangerous fracture in Babylon's belief system, because in Babylon gods were invoked with words. Using the wrong word in prayer meant offending the god. But if the one praying and the one listening could no longer understand the same thing, this meant a roar mixed with the voice of the gods, and the gods did not like roars. It was precisely during this period that a young man carrying bricks on one end of the plain of Shinar quietly stopped working. He washed his hands, put down the bricks, and returned home. He offered no explanation. The next morning, several people who worked with him also quit their jobs in the same manner. When asked for their reasons, they merely shook their heads. "We don't understand anymore," they said. They could not understand what they were saying, what they were supposed to do, or whom they were serving. After this, the first serious delay occurred at the tower. Construction slowed. Fewer bricks were transported. Instructions became incomprehensible. And finally, one day, no one ascended. That morning, when the sun rose, the tower was met with silence for the first time. There were no hammer sounds, no fresh footprints. There were scattered piles of stones at the base of the structure, but no people around. Everyone had left the tower as it was. This silence lasted for days. The priests observed the tower, but no one approached it. Finally, a decision was made. The oldest priest, accompanied by 2 scribes, ascended the tower. They stopped at each step, examining the ancient marks on every wall. As they climbed higher, they noticed that the stones were less regularly placed. When they reached the very top, there was an open space before them. Neither an altar, nor a room, nor any mark, just a flat, empty surface. And in the middle of this surface, a single symbol carved into the ground, an eye. The eye symbol was perfectly drawn, no stylus mark, no sign of wear. It was unclear how or when this symbol was made, but it was there, and the priests who saw it did not speak, because trying to understand what that symbol said would mean stepping outside of words. And the priests of Babylon found wordless belief dangerous. When the priests returned, they told no one what they had seen, but the next day a decision was made. No one was to climb the tower. The structure was to be left as it was. No stone would be removed, no floor completed. The tower was abandoned before completion. But why? Perhaps the eye symbol represented a gaze that humans could not meet. Perhaps the structure had crossed a boundary, not only physically, but also mentally. In the years that followed, discussions about the tower diminished. No stories about the tower were told to children. References to the tower were not erased from tablets, but they were not rewritten either. The tower began to disappear into the past, but everyone who looked at the plain of Shinar knew it was still there. It had not been destroyed, it had merely been left to be forgotten. In Babylon, a saying became common after a while: what rises with brick falls with silence. Although this expression was used to describe the collapse of a structure, it also described man's journey, undertaken with arrogance, ending in solitude. Because the tower, in the end, had become a structure that belonged to no one, neither to the gods nor to the people, neither to the earth nor to the sky. Years later, a scribe living outside Babylon wrote a sentence in his own notes. The first rebellion began with a gaze, spread with a word, ended with silence. This statement summarizes the historical and spiritual essence of the events in the plain of Shinar. Because rebellion does not always begin with a loud noise. Sometimes it begins with a desire, sometimes just by looking at the sky a little too long. Today, only irregular stones remain of the tower on the plain of Shinar, but those stones still face the sky. Everyone who looks at them asks the same question: why did we truly want to ascend? And if that eye symbol is still there, still watching us, perhaps the real question now is, was ascending to the sky a greater rebellion, or was silently descending back? The rise of the sun over the lands of Mesopotamia was always the same, first warming the earth like gold, then beginning to scorch one's back. But for a priest walking the streets of Babylon, this heat was a reminder not only of a seasonal cycle, but also of the weight of knowledge. For in Babylon, knowledge was not merely something learned, but a burden carried. And this burden was not given to everyone. If you were a young scribe living in Babylon, you would quickly realize that wisdom was not a gift. In the inner chambers of the temple, in sections not open to the public, there were tablets written. These were not openly taught. They were kept silently for years before being allowed to be read, because what was written on these tablets was not ordinary information, but prophecies, lines about the future, sometimes about who would die when, sometimes about how a city would be destroyed. But the most interesting thing was that these texts never offered a solution as to what should be done. They only wrote what was and what would be. Wisdom emerged here, to know, but not to interfere. This understanding holds a deep place in Babylonian culture, because in Babylon, Prophecy is not a warning, but a spectacle. Facing what is shown is considered knowledge. Attempting to change it is a curse. One of the oldest examples of this is found in the dream tablets belonging to kings. Every king, after ascending the throne, must have a celestial dream. This dream is recorded by a special scribe and interpreted only by the high priest. If the dream carries a bad omen, the king pretends to have forgotten it, for to speak openly of this dream would be to pave the way for its realization. Babylon's gods give knowledge but are not concerned with how you use it. For them, knowledge is a test, and passing the test sometimes means not answering. This idea, over time, led to a deep silence within the priestly class. Not everyone knew everything, and those who knew often did not speak, because with knowledge came another truth: solitude. A priest working in the inner chambers of the temple once etched this line on his own tablet: "To know is not just to hear. To know is to carry the echo of the voice." This expression describes the burden felt by those who dealt with prophecy in Babylon. They did not just see the future, they also felt its weight, and this weight, over time, would change the person. There was a seer whose name did not appear in Babylonian tablets. His story was passed down through generations in whispers. This person, at a young age, possessed an extraordinary memory. He memorized every symbol at first glance, interpreting the movement of the stars almost instinctively. The priests trained him with special education, but one day, while observing the stars, he saw a pattern. This pattern was not an ordinary cycle. 3 intertwined star clusters slowly formed the shape of an eye, and at that moment the young seer fainted. When he woke, he couldn't speak. He could only write. His first written sentence was, "They will descend again." This sentence was met with fear among the priests, because such an expression could be referring not to the gods, but to the Watchers. And information about the Watchers was found only in the oldest tablets, often incomplete and corrupted, because they were bringers of knowledge, but they had given this knowledge without the gods' permission, and they had been punished. The story of this young seer begins here but does not end easily. As he continued to observe the stars, he began to see new patterns. Each pattern heralded a catastrophe. But these catastrophes could never be stopped. First, a drought began in a small town. Then, an unexpected flood occurred in another region. Each perfectly matched the star patterns the seer had drawn. The priests were divided. One group interpreted his words as the voice of God. The other group argued that it did not come from the gods, but was the influence of another power from ancient times. Because this information did not conform to the systematic nature of God, the gods spoke symbolically, demanding interpretation. But these prophecies were direct and clear. Some sentences were even in the imperative mood. "On the 10th day of the 2nd month, do not go out through the north gate," or, "If fog descends at night, turn south." These were direct instructions rather than mere warnings, and such instructions were always met with suspicion in Babylonian belief. The young seer withdrew from society after a while. He would not speak to anyone in the temple courtyard, only write. The tablets began to fill up. What he wrote were not dreams but explanations, and every explanation led to a new question. People would come outside the temple to see him, but he would not make eye contact with anyone because he had seen something, and what he had seen was like looking from within the eye itself. The stars were no longer just in the sky, he felt their gaze. One night the Babylonian sky grew unusually dark. The stars were gone. The moon was not visible. It was as if the sky had emptied. This situation did not cause panic among the populace, but the priests took it very seriously, because such celestial silences had always signaled a transformation in the past. That night, the young seer emerged from the inner chamber of the temple. He held his last written tablet. On the tablet there was only one line: "Knowledge was given. Because it was forgotten, it was shown again." This sentence caused a great rift in Babylonian thought, because this expression implied that wisdom was cyclical. That is, man had to relearn every piece of knowledge he forgot. But this learning came with a price, just like the forbidden knowledge taught by the Watchers. Once given, then cursed, then it reappeared. The seer disappeared after that day. No one saw him, nor heard his voice. But his tablets remained. And in those tablets there was a wisdom that did not fit into Babylon's official belief system, but could not be ignored either. It was written neither in the language of the gods nor in the voice of humans, but it carried a silence that penetrated anyone who read it. From that day on in Babylon, prophecy tablets were kept in special rooms. Not everyone could access them. Those who wished to read them first took a vow of silence for 3 days, then were taken to shadowed rooms, for it was now understood wisdom is not just intellect, but also respect for silence. Not every piece of knowledge should be spoken, not every truth shared. Some knowledge should simply be carried, like a sacred trust. But then, why was so much information given? If it wasn't to be used, why was it shown? Was wisdom truly a reward, or humanity's oldest curse? Following the disappearance of the young seer, a deep void formed within Babylon. Everyone tried to interpret in their own way what he had seen, why he had left, and what he had meant by that sentence. No ledge was given. Because it was forgotten, it was shown again. These words were now like a whispered prayer in the temple courtyards. But no one could fully grasp their meaning, because in Babylon, knowledge never held a single meaning. Every text, every symbol, every sign carried multiple burdens, and that burden shifted shape depending on the bearer. The tablets left behind by the seer were initially examined only under the supervision of the high priests. Among them were specific dates for the future, strange celestial events, and some incomprehensible symbols. One tablet contained only circles drawn. Each was intertwined, and in the center was again an eye figure. Below the tablet, the following sentence was etched: "Every piece of knowledge comes with an eye. Everything begins not when that eye watches you, but when you see that eye." This expression occupied the priests for a long time, because in Babylonian culture the eye represented not just sight, but also consciousness. The eye was both the seeing and the seen being simultaneously. If an eye was watching you, but you weren't aware of it, that was protection. But if you also saw it, then it became a test. Carrying knowledge, that's where this awareness began. And the test was not in the knowledge itself, but in the decision to be made about what to do with it. With this thought, for the first time in Babylon, a distance towards knowledge began to develop. Previously, learning was a desired virtue. Now, learning had turned into an unsettling act. The number of tablets taught to young scribe apprentices in temple schools was reduced. Some symbols were removed. Even some ancient texts were removed from official records, because what was to be done with that knowledge was no longer known. An unknown knowledge for Babylon meant danger. Another priest living during this period wrote the following sentence on his own tablet: "When the knower remains silent, knowledge gains value." This was a significant shift in Babylonian thought. Now knowledge began to be glorified not when shared, but when carried protectively. Because the story of the young seer had shown that too much knowledge sometimes brought solitude to a person, and this solitude was filled not with silence, but with the echoes within. The priest's new approach gradually began to affect the public as well. Now, People did not pray when looking at the stars, they merely bowed their heads. They hoped not to see a sign from the heavens rather than to see one, because seeing something came with a price, and it was not a burden everyone could bear. A saying began to circulate among the people: "Those who look at the sky too much age prematurely." This was an expression not of knowledge, but of the weariness it brought. Also during this period, a group of priests put forward a theory based on one of the tablets left by the seer. According to them, the source of the prophecies was not the gods, but an ancient wisdom. This wisdom was neither fully divine nor human. It came from an in-between place. Perhaps it was the remnants of beings who had once descended from the sky to the earth, then were forgotten, but whose knowledge remained inscribed in the stars. Some called them fallen beings, others forgotten teachers. But the common point was that this knowledge came on a timeline hidden from the gods. This idea was dangerous for Babylonian belief, because if knowledge did not come from the gods, what was its source? And if this source was not trustworthy, what did it mean to acquire that knowledge? These questions were incessant. Secret meetings were held within the temple. Some tablets were sealed, others destroyed, because even approaching Shayāṭīn, knowledge had to have a limit, and Babylon was now walking on the edge of that limit. Yet some priests decided to preserve this ancient knowledge. To them, this knowledge was not cursed, but simply misunderstood, and if carefully read, held in the right hands, it could benefit humanity. This group believed that carrying knowledge was not a curse, but a service. But this service had to be performed in silence. Tablets were not to be left open, but only read by priests who had taken a vow of silence. One of these priests later authored an important text. The text consisted of only 13 lines and was called the Shadow Tablet. The expressions in this tablet summarize Babylon's approach to knowledge. Knowledge is not the voice of God. Knowledge begins with a carried eye. This eye does not look, it only remembers. And everyone who remembers carries the sky on their back. These lines became a kind of oath for the priests of Babylon. Every new scribe apprentice was made to memorize these lines, but their meaning was not explained. Everyone had to carry their own burden, find their own meaning, because wisdom began not with someone else's words, but with one's own silence. As years passed, the name of the young seer was forgotten, but his sentence remained. Knowledge was given. Because it was forgotten, it was shown again. This sentence was etched into a corner of Babylon's star calendars. Everyone who saw it, for a moment, lifted their head to the sky. Then they lowered their eyes to the ground, because knowledge was still there. But this time, no one openly called for it. And perhaps knowledge had to be carried this way, in whispers, in silence, avoiding eye contact. Because knowledge was not a light, but sometimes a shadow you dared not look at. As time progressed, stone tablets piled up in Babylon's silent corridors. In the shadowed rooms of the temples, hundreds of texts accumulated, each filled with different prophecies, observations, and symbols. But most of these tablets were no longer read aloud, for in Babylon, prophecy had ceased to be knowledge and had become a burden. Every tablet read left the reader with a new question but no answer. Wisdom had become not a solution, but a greater uncertainty. Those who felt the cost of carrying knowledge most were no longer scribes, but priests. For in the temples the duty was not only to write, but also to be unable to forget what was written. And every unforgettable line over time turned into an echo in one's inner world. Sleeping became difficult, dreams became different. Even an ordinary Babylonian priest now swore that every time he looked at the stars, he saw a familiar pattern. The sky was no longer just above us. It had penetrated us. Knowledge had become less a gaze and more an inner voice. In some tablets written during this period, there was talk not of the future but of the past, for the priest realized that prophecies might not always be about what lay ahead. Some prophecies were written to remind of what had been forgotten. One tablet stated, "Time moves forward, but knowledge returns." This sentence perhaps did not fundamentally change Babylon's view of knowledge, but it silently redirected its course. Now knowledge was like a directionless entity, an entity whose beginning and end were unknown, but which always left a trace. Still, a group among the priests continued to silently adhere to the young seer's writings. They found knowledge not cursed, but patient. That is, knowledge revealed itself to its owner, not at once but over time. But patience, for a society that calculated time like Babylon, was the most difficult virtue, because everything here was recorded, every moment, every day, every celestial movement. Because it was a period when everyone realized they had forgotten something, but they didn't know what they had forgotten. And perhaps that was the young seer's last words too. Knowledge had been given, but people had forgotten to remember it. On the temple tablets, after a while, the following lines began to be etched. Knowledge belongs to the one who is silent, not the one who asks. The tongue cannot carry what the eye sees. Stars do not speak. Humans, too, sometimes, should be silent. These lines heralded the end of an era in Babylon. Wisdom was no longer rank, nor height, nor even something measurable by words. Wisdom was now a form of silence, and this silence had reached everywhere, from Babylon's highest ziggurat to a shepherd in the smallest village. As years passed, even the young seer's name was forgotten, but whenever the sky was looked upon, his single sentence was remembered. Knowledge was given. Because it was forgotten, it was shown again. Whenever this sentence was whispered again, the people of Babylon bowed their heads. And perhaps for the first time they fully felt what it meant to carry knowledge, because knowledge is sometimes not a light, but a shadow, and some shadows illuminate only those who look within them. Among the priests of Babylon, there was knowledge not spoken aloud, but quietly passed down. The deluge brought silence not only to humans, but also to those who came before. The deluge narrative in Babylon's oldest tablets is often perceived merely as a great flood disaster, but careful readers know that the deluge came not just with water, but with silence. And when the waters receded, what remained was not just mud, but the echoes of a silenced era. For the deluge was the end not of the gods, but of those who preceded the gods. If you could enter Babylon's ancient archives, one of the first things you would notice would be that if you were an ordinary observer in Babylon, you would not encounter any written information about these beings, but on some stones in the street, on the edges of temple stairs, even in old waterways, some carved signs might catch your attention. Star-shaped symbols with an eye in the center, spiral motifs confined within a triangle, zigzags descending from above. These were not random, but the ancient calling languages of forgotten beings. One common feature of the places where these symbols were found was their proximity to water. For the deluge was not just a punishment, but also a seal. And in Babylonian thought, water was both purificatory and preservative. The deluge not only erased, but also buried. But it had not been possible to completely silence the voice of what was buried. From time to time, especially when certain star alignments appeared in the sky, some priests would write that they heard the names of these beings in their dreams. However, these dreams were never recounted aloud. They were only recorded in private tablets with lines that had no headings. One tablet reads, "In my dream, there was one. It had no eyes, but it saw everything. It asked my name, but did not give its own. When I awoke, I heard silence, and that silence was deeper than all the sounds I knew." Such narratives led to the development of a deep culture of silence within the Babylonian priestly class. Knowledge of the unknown was the most dangerous knowledge, because everything undefined needs a name. And in Babylon, everything with a name could be invoked. Over time, a division occurred among the priests. One group argued that ignoring the knowledge of these forgotten beings was safer. The other group, however, quietly began to follow the traces of these beings. This second group consisted mostly of priests who were interested in the sky. They saw the stars not only for measuring. This narrative created a deep unease among Babylon's young priests, because the line between seeking knowledge and transforming into knowledge had become blurred. One tablet states, "If the eye is not looking at you, there is peace. But if you look at it, silence is broken." This sentence implies that in Babylon, it was ideal for the celestial gaze to be one-sided. Being watched, if unnoticed, does not disturb. But when the gaze is returned, a dialogue begins. And this dialogue brings not only knowledge but also responsibility. The silence of the pre-deluge beings is an expression of both forgetting and protection for Babylon, because knowledge does not always have to be explained. Some knowledge simply remains. It only begins to echo when someone touches it, and post-deluge Babylon chose to remain silent. Because silence is both a form of protection and a form of remembrance, and perhaps that is why Babylon still has elders who silently gaze at the stars at night. They desire not to see something, but not to see. Because the eyes of those who came before the deluge are still there. They have not closed, they have merely not responded. But what if one day when a star falls, accidental contact is made with that eye? Then will knowledge be remembered again, or will the deluge begin anew? In Babylon, silence was often confused with forgetfulness, but the priests living in the plain of Shinar knew well that this was not the case. Silence was not the absence of knowledge, but its form of preservation. The traces of pre-deluge beings were hidden within this silence. They were not explicitly mentioned, but neither were they entirely disregarded, because the people of Babylon, if they did not mention something by name, believed not that it was gone, but that its remembrance was dangerous. And the story of those who came before the deluge stood precisely on this line. According to them, this knowledge came not from the position of the stars, but from dreams. Dreams in Babylon were an area not considered divine, but still sacred. Through dreams, not only a person's inner voice, but sometimes forgotten fragments of memory would return. And among these memories, there was a period called pre-water time. Very little information remained about this period, but some expressions in dream tablets carried traces of a communication established with different beings during this period. One dream stated, "There were 7 lines in the sky, each whispered a name, but my tongue could not carry those names. I awoke, silence remained in my ear." This sentence shows the symbolic narrative power of Babylon, a tongue that cannot carry a name, a silence that carries a voice. This was a prophecy that touched not only knowledge, but also the form of that knowledge. For in Babylonian belief, every unspoken word was considered dangerous. Either it was too ancient, or it was still alive. During this period, some symbols silently added to the temple archives indicated that a new perspective on pre-deluge beings was emerging. Figures previously expressed only as an eye now began to be encircled with wing-like drawings. These drawings did not clearly resemble angels or gods, but it was clear that they pointed to something rising from the earth. And this was not a common occurrence in Babylon, because Babylon's gods usually descended from the sky. But these figures seemed to be rising from the earth. Perhaps the deluge was not just a destroyer, but also a barrier. And now, some things were reappearing from where they were buried. A note in a priest's journal was quite striking. "Silence is the breath of what is buried deep." This expression suggested that in Babylon, silence was no longer just forgetfulness, but also a kind of waiting, that is, the pre, but it wasn't a name, not really, or it wasn't anymore. Babylon's chroniclers had erased that name from the texts, and if a name was erased from a text, according to Babylon, it should no longer exist, But some things, even if erased from writing, would remain in memory, especially if that memory was filled with prayers a priest had silently learned for years, dreams he had seen in his sleep, and signs he had noticed in the spaces between the stars. Then that silent name would become unforgettable. In Babylon, the word forbidden was not only used in the sense of being against the rules, it also meant to be protected, to be unmentioned, even if not forgotten, because some names were invoked by being remembered, and one of these names existed even before it was etched into the oldest stones of time. This name was first alluded to with a drawing in the margin of a stone tablet, a symbol resembling a circle marked in its center with 3 short lines. It wasn't writing, but every priest who saw it felt the same thing, the presence of something that should not be spoken of. A young priest, serving at Esagila at the time, recorded this mark in a marginal note. The note was short and clear. Around this mark, the wind changed. No prayer was offered, but something had come. In Babylon, signs were erased before names, because a name was explicit while a symbol was an intuitive presence. And what was forbidden was intuition itself. Rumors circulating among the priests indicated that this symbol was connected to pre-deluge beings. That is, with those first figures who came from the sky but could not settle on earth before the complete separation between gods and humans. They were never included in Babylon's writing system, because to commit a name to writing meant to bring it into the system, and some beings belonged to no system. When a text was erased in Babylon, they are from the darkness of the mind, and darkness sometimes is the truest trace left by light. This debate ultimately led to a new practice being initiated in Babylon's central archives, the Register of Erased Names. But no name was ever written in this register. Only symbols, number sequences, and blank spaces were recorded. Initially, these records served as a silent form of protection. However, over time, some priests who looked at this register realized that these blanks not only encouraged forgetting but also remembering. One day, a young scribe working in the archive room tried to read the blanks in the register aloud. Reading aloud was a common method used in Babylonian education. However, it was not applied to such silent texts, because silence meant not only wordlessness but also the absence of sound. That evening the young scribe's eyes turned red, his speech slowed, and the next morning he was found in his room with a note. The void poured into me. Every silence was an echo. Now, whatever I hear, it seems to carry that name within. What happened to the scribe was never officially recorded. However, after that incident, the register of erased names was only stored in sealed boxes. A system was put in place where it could only be accessed by the simultaneous presence of 2 high-ranking priests, because it was now believed that those blanks carried not just information, but a kind of sound. In Babylon, stones were used not only for writing, but also as a source of sound. In some ceremonies, priests would strike stones to produce sounds at specific frequencies. These sounds did not turn into text, but they carried meaning. Could the blanks of forbidden names now be recalled not only by reading but also by these sounds? This idea worried some elderly priests, because even if the name was forgotten, if its echo was within the stone, then the call was still. His duty was no longer to copy the prayer texts he had repeated countless times, but to try to understand some tablets of unknown origin. These did not resemble ordinary tablets. Most were incomplete, and some visibly carried no writing at all. But when held, a weight was felt. More than a physical weight, it was a density that seemed to create pressure in the memory. The scribe placed the tablet on a special table. The table was surrounded by stones taken from those narrow corridors where the sun never rose. If these stones remained in darkness for a long time, they would begin to glow on their own, turning slightly reddish. In Babylon, such stones were called memory stones, because it was said that over time they remembered not light, but sound, and sometimes whispers were heard near these stones. The whispers were not specific words, but more like a being's attempt to draw attention. When the scribe placed the tablet on the table, the whispering did not begin. However, the air in the room noticeably changed. Old lingering smells, a mixture of dried clay and ancient bitumen, grew heavy. In this room, some books sealed decades ago had been opened, then closed again, because their entire contents had not been read. Each page increased the burden of the previous one. Upon careful examination of the tablet, a type of scratching mark was found on it. These marks did not follow a specific direction but spread chaotically left and right, but a careful eye could notice a repetition within this disorder, a circle, a half line, then 3 cuts. The same symbol, the mark of the forbidden. Here again. This symbol was first noticed by another scribe 3 years ago on a different tablet, but that tablet had later been resealed on the grounds of misclassification. Now the same symbol had reappeared on a different tablet. This recurrence created a wave of concern among some, because here, not light, but silence had to be observed. Initially, 32 tablets were taken to this archive. The common feature of these tablets was the presence of the forbidden symbol in some way. In some, it was visible. In others, it was only felt within the stone's internal structure. Some of the young priests assigned to transport these tablets announced a few days later that they wished to resign from their temple duties. They cited complaints such as disturbing dreams, silently calling voices, and constantly seeing the same figure. One priest, after 3 sleepless nights, had said, "When everything falls silent, that sound rises, and it always asks me the same thing. Why did you erase me?" This statement brought a new dimension to the issue of forbidden names, because this was not just a part of the past, it was also part of the present, and perhaps it was a warning for the future. For the first time in Babylon, it began to be thought that a name, even if erased, might not disappear. On the contrary, what was erased sometimes became more remembered, more deeply affected. After a while, a tablet disappeared from the void archive. The entrance was sealed, the assigned priests were on guard, but the tablet was gone. An investigation was launched. No one had entered. There was no physical trace. However, a few days after the incident, the symbol reappeared on the lower part of a stone pillar in the courtyard of the central temple, and this time it was more distinct, as if someone had deliberately etched it, but this was impossible, because this area was accessible only to high priests. After this incident, a deep silence fell among the high priests. Nothing spoken was committed to writing, but everyone felt the same thing. What was forbidden was no longer hidden. It revealed itself without being seen, becoming more distinct despite being erased, and this was because for some knowledge it was not the form but the trace that mattered, and the trace was felt most deeply through touch. According to old masters, erasing a being's name meant not erasing its existence, but merely changing the way it was invoked. That is, when you scratched out a name, it didn't disappear, it just changed its voice. This belief, over time, formed the foundation of the silent cults in Babylon. Groups not affiliated with the temples, but who maintained their rituals with time and care. They argued that the forbidden names were no longer forbidden, but had come to be expressed in a different way. The leader of one of these groups was a former high scribe who had left the central scriptorium years ago. His name had been erased from official records, but his students still called him the scribe of shadows. This scribe no longer left a symbol or writing. Instead, he left a trace on the stones with only a vibration. With a small hammer blow, he created a crack in the internal structure of the stone, then caressed it with his palm. This crack was not visible from the outside, but it changed the internal structure of the stone. The voice of the writing had become not visible but palpable. One day, one of the groups associated with this scribe found a half-buried tablet in a dried-up riverbed outside the city. The tablet was old, very old. Its writing style belonged to no known period of Babylon. However, when touched, it was felt to vibrate slightly, as if it had a pulse. And right in the middle, That ancient symbol, which had been erased countless times in Babylon, now stood with perfect clarity, as if it had never been erased. When the tablet was brought, the scribe of shadows remained silent. To him, this was no longer a message, but a sign of return. That is, what was written had not been erased. It had merely waited to return. Now its time had. Then how can we truly silence it? Over time, this question crossed the borders of Babylon. Similar symbols began to appear in other cities of Mesopotamia. Each city sought its own solution. Some silenced it, some accepted it. But one thing was common. The impact of an erased name could be more powerful than that of a written one. Today, most of those tablets are gone. The symbols are lost within the stones. The traces of echo writings remain beneath the earth, but still on some nights the stars take the same shape. Some people have the same dream, and some words, even if they have never been consciously learned, escape from lips. Perhaps the most silent truth history teaches us is this: some names do not disappear when erased. On the contrary, when erased, they stay with us forever. And now I leave you with a silent question. Today, what name do you think you have forgotten might still be watching you? Nights, in Babylon's later periods, were a little longer. The colors of the sunset seemed to have changed. The sky, mingling with the sand, took on a reddish hue rather than the familiar golden yellow. This change in color, though appearing to be a simple natural phenomenon, was a sign for the ancient scribes working in the temple shadows. The sky was now speaking in a different language. Babylon's familiar symbols were shifting, and the stars could no longer be observed as they once were. Observers standing atop the ziggurats continued to keep records every night. But now, the stars indicated not just direction, but also unrest. One star would appear earlier in the east, another would resist the morning light in the west, delaying its fading. To understand the meaning of these small deviations, very ancient tablets were consulted. And in those tablets, broken lines concerning names officially disregarded were surfacing. Iron came to Babylon from outside, Hubar. In Babylon, these narratives had always been passed down in hushed tones. But now, those gathered around the fire were practically rediscovering this knowledge. Unbeknownst to them, an ancient cycle had been entered. The figures seen in the dreams of blacksmith apprentices resembled the symbols on ancient tablets. This resemblance was disturbing. Because these children had no temple education, they had not seen sacred texts. Yet their hands, as if carrying the memory of another time, found the right shape. And in every metal forged, an echo was felt, as if someone was watching them, guiding them, shaping them. Over time, some blacksmiths began to refuse to deliver swords without etching a mark on them. These marks carried the traces not of ancient gods, but of the watchers. They were supposedly ordinary marks: an eye trapped within a triangle, an open palm facing upwards, or a 9-pointed star. But all of them conveyed the same feeling: you are being watched. With this period, 2 languages emerged in Babylon. One, the silent and regulated language used by official scribes. The other was the language of blacksmiths, travelers, and apprentices, a more intuitive and ancient language consisting mostly of symbols and signs. No one openly taught this second language, but people learned it, because that language over time asserted itself. It appeared in dreams, in hands, in drawings, and so a rupture occurred in Babylon. The temples had ceased to write the names of the watchers, but the people, unknowingly, were invoking them again. This invocation was happening neither through prayers nor rituals. On the contrary, every piece of metal forged with fire was an echo, and the watchers were returning with these echoes. Over time, the city was destroyed. Babylon never regained its former glory. Ziggurats fell into ruin, temples grew silent, libraries filled with sand. But some,